Hello, everybody, and welcome. It is wonderful to see such a great turnout to our first Terra Foundation online event. Thank you for joining us, especially at this momentous time. This is Walker Evans and Renewals of Documentary with Stephanie Schwartz and Quentin Bajac. My name is Lucy Pike, and I will be co-hosting this event with Caroline Gergen, Associate Professor of American Studies at Sorbonne Université and a Terra Foundation Fellow. I'd like to thank Elisa Schar for conceiving this event and our speakers for accepting our invitation. Stephanie and Quentin will each give a 15-minute presentation. They will then be in conversation together, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions afterwards by using the raise hand tool. If all goes well, we will be together for about an hour and 15 minutes. This event will be recorded and posted on the Foundation's YouTube channel and website. Without further ado, I will let Caroline introduce this session's topic, Walker Evans and Renewals of Documentary, and our speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual dialogue on Walker Evans and Renewals of American Documentary. Thank you very much to the speakers, Stephanie Schwartz and Quentin Bajac, and to the Terra Foundation for American Art for always sparking such inspirational conversations, now even online and with a much larger audience. So we're coming together on the occasion of Professor Stephanie Schwartz's new book, Walker Evans, No Politics, published with the University of Texas Press in June 2020. We're having this conversation on the eve of what many consider the most important US election in decades. The title of the book, No Politics, may seem anachronistic in this highly politicized climate. It refers to a statement of 1935 when Evans was hired for the Resettlement Administration and concluded, "No politics," in all caps, whatever, quote end. Professor Schwartz takes the photographer's disavowal of politics as a point of departure to investigate how documentary, as a form with a history, has reinvented itself. In a time when the need to question origin stories is more pressing than ever, the book makes us rethink the origins of documentary photography in the New Deal politics of the 1930s. Tonight, Stephanie Schwartz and Quentin Bajac invite us to go a bit further and to consider the renewals of the documentary form, by Evans himself, and later on, between the 1960s and 1990s, by photographers Allan Sekula and Stephen Shore, who were drawing on Evans's historical work. So what did it mean for Sekula and for Shore to revisit Evans in the late 20th century? How does this influence manifest itself? And how can we perhaps re-envision histories of photography through the issue of influence? This may also lead us to ask in which forms we encounter the documentary today and how it is mediated, an aspect to which Evans himself was very much attached. So there's a lot to talk about here, and it is with great pleasure that I would like to now introduce our speakers. Stephanie Schwartz is Associate Professor of American Art and Photography at University College London. After receiving her PhD from Columbia University, she was postdoctoral fellow at Bryn Mawr College and at the Courtauld Institute of Art. Professor Schwartz has edited several publications, including a Tate Modern in Focus project on Allan Sekula's Waiting for Tear Gas in 2016. She recently received a Terra Foundation travel grant for her project, The Native and the National, Documentary and Fascism in the Era of the New Deal. And we, of course, look forward to hearing more about this exciting project in the future. Our second speaker is Quentin Bajac. Since 2018, he is the director of the Galerie Nationale du Jeu de Paume in Paris, and prior to this, he was curator of photography at the Musée d'Orsay, head of the photography department at Centre Pompidou, and head curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Next to teaching at the École du Louvre in Paris, he is the author of, among others, a 3-volume history of photography. Quentin Bajac has curated many exhibitions across Europe and the US, including most recently, perhaps also most importantly for our talk, Stephen Shore, Solving Pictures. I'll leave the Zoom floor now to the speakers, and we will come back for questions at the end of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for that generous introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I would like to thank the Terra for the invitation to speak tonight, and in particular, Elisa Schar for organizing this dialogue. My presentation this evening begins where my book Walker Evans' No Politics ends, namely with a consideration of the work of Allan Sekula, or to be more exact, with a consideration of how and why Evans's work figures in Sekula's 1978 call for the reinvention of documentary. As I state in my coda, this was the only way to end a book about documentary and its histories. That is to say, the only way to end was to insist that there is no going back to the beginning, to Evans or the 1930s, though not because, as many writing about Sekula's call have insisted, it was finally necessary to relegate the 30s and its photographic record to the past. That, I argue, was not Sekula's task. The very idea of writing history that way, as something that can be or should be overcome or corrected, runs against the grain of his work and significantly the work of documentary. I return to these claims this evening in order to stress one simple fact. Documentary is a means of representation. It is neither mute nor dumb. It is not the this of photography. A reminder of this fact seems to be in order again, or now, as the photographic record of the 1930s is said to be, or made to look, familiar, to show us what it looks like to live through a depression, or that a depression is what many in America and elsewhere are now living through. My concern tonight, in turn, is not with the 30s, nor is it with the 70s. It is with the stories, the fish stories and folktales, to borrow Sekula's terms, that we like to tell about the past. The mode of telling that I turn to tonight is prayer. It is a mode that might, albeit somewhat facetiously, be apropos at the moment, on the eve of the presidential election in the US. Prayer, as Sekula once put it, is a compelling, ironic exercise for the irreligious. In 2004, Sekula completed the first of a 4-part prayer or psalm he called Prayer for the Americans. The first part, which I will consider this evening, is a slide sequence of 39 photographs that Sekula shot during what he described as a quote-unquote pilgrimage to that area of the United States once known as the Gateway to the West. We begin, though, with a view onto the whole world. As one slide drops into the next, at 12-second intervals, we move from a fishing hole in Jacksonville, Illinois, to Mark Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri, by way of Tom Sawyer's Cave. We end at Lincoln's tomb. The journey happens twice. Twice, that is, the global meets the local. Twice, fiction crosses history. And twice, bodies stand, pose, work, survive in between. Spin the globe, touch the nose. The haptic crosses the optic, as in Sekula's study of the mediations of the first Gulf War, war without bodies. Though here, it is just a trace of the touch that is captured, gleaming and shining. Touching the statue's nose is said to bring good luck. My recall to war, as much as to the caressing of America's monuments, is not gratuitous. Prayer is a war prayer, or at least it is in conversation with the one that Mark Twain penned in 1904. Not published until 1923 after Twain's death, the war prayer tells the story of a preacher gathering his congregation together to pray for the safety of a group of young men about to embark on an unnamed war. In the midst of the prayer, an aged stranger, as Twain calls him, enters the church to recite what he refers to as the prayer's other half, the call for the evisceration of the enemy. O Lord our God, help us to tear their soldiers to bloody shreds with our shells. Help us to cover their smiling fields with the pale forms of their patriot dead. Help us to drown the thunder of the guns with the shrieks of their wounded, writhing in pain. Help us to lay waste their humble homes with a hurricane fire. He goes on and on. The stranger is ignored, written off as a lunatic. War prayer is Twain's response to the Spanish-American War, to America's first imperial adventure beyond the frontier that had by the close of the 19th century become the West. It is also, like much of Twain's writings, a satire about the paradoxes of American liberalism, about the necessary correspondence between liberty and tyranny or empire. The loudest yelps for liberty, as Domenico Lacerdo reminds us in his counter-history of the political philosophy, came from the drivers of slaves. Accordingly, our habitual hagiography, with its celebration of white men and their morals, is, to quote Lucerdo, an assault on the memory of the victims. I turn to prayer this evening because, as my title suggests, I want to think about how we remember or make a memory of this beginning. It is because I want to suggest that it's not enough to acknowledge the past and the present, to remind ourselves that in 2003, the torturer-in-chief, to borrow Sekula's epitaph for George W. Bush, prayed loudly for the troops that he was sending to Iraq. Nor is it enough to acknowledge that the Cheeto-in-chief, Donald Trump, makes a mockery of those traditions with his props and his photo ops. It is necessary instead to defamiliarize the past. When I first saw prayer, I could not but see the 1930s. By this, I mean its photographic record. This was so despite the fact that Sekula's photographs record the Middle West, not the South. I saw, for example, these photographs by Dorothea Lange of the vacated tenant farms in Childress County, Texas. But more than echoes or allusions to the photographic record through which we have come to know the Depression, I felt like I was watching a replay of the photographic portfolio opening the 1941 documentary, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, in these photographs of a family on the banks of the river. This sequence held my attention. It had to. These photographs remain on or return to the screen for more than 2 minutes, a third of the work's duration. 11 slides drop before we leave this family behind. It is long enough to recognize that this scene of domesticity and its reproduction had already been seen. That Sekula would recall the collaboration between Evans and Agee is hardly surprising, and not just because Let Us Now Praise Famous Men also presents itself as a prayer or a psalm. As I argued in the closing pages of Walker Evans' No Politics, he had already remade the documentary with his 1973 photo work, Aerospace Folktales. Composed, like Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, of 2 modes of graphic inscription, photographs and texts, Aerospace Folktales is a record of unemployment. It is a record of the work that takes place at home, in Sekula's home, when there is no paid work. We see his mother arranging flowers and his father arranging the lamps. The references to Let Us Now Praise Famous Men are not subtle. As Sekula puts it in an interview from 1999, the same year he began shooting prayer, I had spent a couple of years looking at photography books and hoped that the clapboard siding visible behind my parents' back might call up uneasy memories of Walker Evans's portraits of Alabama sharecroppers. Sekula's recall or remake is not nostalgic. It is combative. Just 2 years before he completed Aerospace Folktales, the Museum of Modern Art in New York held a major retrospective of Evans's work. Blown up and framed, Evans's photographs were stripped from their pages. As the title of the exhibition announced, the museum delivered Photographs by Walker Evans. There were no pages on view. There were also no collaborators. Evans, as the exhibition's curator, John Sarkowski, announced or assumed, was a stubbornly self-directed artist. Evans supported this hagiography. In his 1971 interview with Leslie Katz, given on the occasion of the exhibition, Evans provided his historians with the category documentary style and waxed lyrically about the transcendence of art. As Sekula explained in the closing pages of his 1984 essay, The Body in the Archive, the elderly Evans, transformed into a senior figure of modernist genius by a curatorial apparatus with its own archival imperative, could no longer recognize the combative and anti-archival stance of his earlier sequential work. Sekula had the uncaptioned pages of the 1938 publication American Photographs in mind. It had been reissued with captions in 1960. By 1971, Evans's portraits were no longer uneasy. This is not because documentary had been made over as art, was deemed a style. It was because it was celebrated as liberal. The tenant farmers were individuated and identified as poor. With Aerospace Folktales, Sekula did not contemn American documentary as the story usually goes. He attended to those, including Evans, writing its history. To quote Sekula at length from a 2005 interview with Carlos Guerra, Walker Evans's sharecropper standing up against the clapboard siding was reworked as an image of an unemployed aerospace engineer and his wife in front of a similar wall. This was very conscious on my part, not because the Walker Evans photograph was a masterpiece to be cited for reasons of prestige or postmodern anti-authorial aggression, but rather because I wanted to raise the question of what it meant to shift the focus of social documentary photography towards the middle classes and the lower middle class, moving away from the agricultural proletariat and the sharecroppers of the American South. In other words, could the rhetorical limits of documentary allow the radical substitution of one subject matter for another in the name of social investigation much closer to home? Difference, not similarity, motivates this remake. It is the differences between then and now and then, that allow us to see what was actively repressed in the 1960s and 70s. Namely, that Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is also a work about class. This photograph of a white landlord with his wrinkled suit starts off the documentary's call for remembrance. Let us now praise famous men and our fathers that beget us. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is not about poverty in its journalistic construction. It is about the organization of the profane space, private property, for the community of the free. It is about the paradoxes of liberalism. With his remakes, Sekula takes stock of the stories we like to tell about the past by reminding us to acknowledge who typically does the telling. Likewise, he reminds us that influence also or always runs backwards. Evans is influenced. In turn, my suggestion that we see Evans in Sekula's work, in his prayer, is a way to provoke a conversation about how the 1930s looks today. It is to recall Evans' work with an effort to see in it much more than a record of the or a depression. Prayer allows us to see a way of writing out of that anecdote. Finally, it allows memories to remain uneasy, because despite the present state of affairs, the mockery made with props and photo ops, the empire of liberty has not, as we are often told today, failed. The end is not in sight. There is just the potential for a future to be different. For that, though, we need more than prayer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Stephanie, for this wonderful and short presentation. I hope we can pick up on some of the aspects you mentioned, specifically the combative remakes of documentary later on in the dialogue. I suggest we now turn to Quentin Bajac's presentation and then have the dialogue afterwards.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Stephanie, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for their invitation. I shall talk tonight about approximately the same period, the 70s, even if Stephanie mentioned that she was not talking about a period, but she mentioned the 70s. But from a very different perspective, with the work of Stephen Shaw, who, and I think it's worth mentioning, is of exactly or approximately the same generation as Sekula. Shaw was born in 47, so 4 years before Sekula. So after spearheading the movement known as the New Color Photography in the US in the 70s and directing the photography department at Bard College since 1982, Shaw became a major catalyst in the renewal of documentary photography in the late 1990s, both in the US and Europe, especially in Germany, where his work had struck a chord from the very beginning. So like the German, in fact, photographers Bird and Hilla Becher before him, Shaw kind of synthesized local photographic history, in his case, an American tradition spanning from Carlton Watkins to Walker Evans, with influences from various artistic movements, from conceptual to pop, and even photorealism. And this is, in fact, this rethinking by Shaw of Evans' work through conceptual pop and photorealism in the 70s that I would like to focus on here. So in 2004, Shaw asserted in an interview, and I quote him, "If I were to say in the photographic world the one person whom I use as a springboard for ideas and as a resource to learn from, it was Walker Evans," end of quote. Among the photographers that Shaw refers to, Evans holds a special place. This is evident not only in the frequency of Shaw's references to him, but also in Evans' wide-ranging influence on the younger photographers, sometimes to the point of apparent pastiche, as in Shaw's 1981 series Annie that you have here on the screen. So Shaw was invited on the set of the film Annie that John Huston was shooting in Burbank, California. And Annie takes place in the Lower East Side in the 30s, and Shaw's images are definitely a tribute under the form of a pastiche to several photographers of the period, from Berenice Abbott to, of course, Walker Evans. Evans was among, in fact, Shaw's earliest photographic references by way of his book, American Photographs, which was given to Shaw for his 10th birthday. Moreover, Shaw came of age as a photographer in the early 70s, a time when Evans was undergoing a major rediscovery with exhibition interviews, etc. This has already been mentioned by Stephanie, so I shall not come back to it. Just mention that indeed Shaw's choice of the title American Surfaces for his first photographic series on America was a nod to Evans' American photographs and probably also to his other mentor, Andy Warhol, as the concept of surface is a very Warholian one. Having said this, and even if Shaw knew, of course, of Evans' long career, it is definitely the early Evans, the Evans of American photographs, that remains for him the main influence. In 2004, in another interview, Shaw is very explicit about that, and I quote him once again, quote, "I knew by the time I was 20 that Timothy O'Sullivan had an active life in photography of maybe 10 years. I knew all the Walker Evans pictures I loved were made in an 18-month period, Robert Frank too. And coming to photography in the late 20th century, it's impossible not to know all this. And these aren't minor photographers, these are the best. These are the people who have changed the medium. Frank and Evans are not lesser because their creative hot streak was a couple of years." A couple of years, meaning probably a little longer than the 18-month period that Shaw mentioned, but let's say 5 to 6 years between 1930 and 36. This is the Evans that Shaw was looking at that time. Symptomatically, it is his two major series of the 70s, early 80s, American Surfaces and Uncommon Places, that the kingship with Evans is the more explicit. American Surfaces, to be very quickly, is a series of color photographs that Shaw began using a Rolleiflex 35, and that was initially focused on a trip from New York to the southern United States. The series is often described as an American road trip, but it goes far beyond this and continued for more than a year and a half to the end of 73. The end of the series was marked by Shaw's abandonment of the Rolleiflex for a 4x5 camera, a change in device that would allow him for more detailed negatives and larger prints, and would mark the beginning of Uncommon Places that you have here, one image, begun in 73, which inhabits in fact the same world and deals with the same themes as American Surfaces, that is the American urban landscape, but that was shot first with a 4x5 camera, then with an 8x10 view camera from 1974. So the focus on America is clearly one of the main common denominators in the two photographers' work. In one of Shaw's first interviews, he discussed the ways in which his work aligned with Evans, and I quote him, "in terms of both of us photographing the same country at different times, both using the same type of camera, both having an interest in architecture, etc." End of quote. Elaborating on his relationship to architecture, Shaw later added in 2003, quote, "I see architecture as an external representation of the forces political, social, aesthetic at play in our culture. This I got from Evans," end of quote. The ties between their work are numerous, going beyond those cited by Shaw. Both are, of course, fascinated by endangered forms of popular culture, such as the postcards, by the centrality of the automobile in American culture. Shaw has always been interested in the cars in Evans' photographs, and especially the role they play as markers of time, but also by signage. Papart had a strong influence on Shaw's interest in sign generated by popular culture, commercial signs, ads, logos, posters. For Shaw, the pop influence complemented the inspiration he derived from Walker Evans, whose attachment to vernacular American culture could be seen in his collection of road signs and symbols, as well as in his collection of postcards, some of which, in fact, were on display in the 1971 exhibition at Yale University Art Gallery that Shaw so. So the omnipresence of the sign, amplified by the uncompromising precision of the 8x10 camera, explain why a number of Shaw photographs, particularly those from the 70s, are as much to be read as to be looked at. And of course, this could be said of Evans too. Shaw's interest in the idiosyncrasies of the American contemporary vernacular culture, in the footsteps of Evans, did not go unnoticed in the architectural discourse of the 70s. In 1975, as a result of their common interest and affinity, he was commissioned by the architects Robert Venturi, Dennis Scott Brown, and Stephen Isnor to contribute photographs of roadside iconography and typical streets in American suburbia to the 76 exhibition Signs of Life, Symbols in the American City. The architects had for some time pursued a theoretical and visual investigation of the American suburban landscape, and through research projects such as Learning from Las Vegas would fundamentally shift the profession's attention away from the heroic proposition of late modern architecture and toward the aesthetic and spatial logic of these seemingly unplanned places. In Shaw's topographic approach, the architects found a methodology that rendered their projects visible. In switching in 1973 from a small camera to a 4x5 and then an 8x10 camera, Shaw was in many respects in tune with some of his contemporaries. But the generation that came of age in the 70s was a cool generation. I mean, keeping things at a distance, in contrast to the photographers of the 60s who favored close proximity to the subject and were still influenced by a snapshot aesthetic, the idea of the decisive moment, photojournalistic style, and in some cases, an explicitly engaged perspective. On several occasions, Shaw has mentioned that Uncommon Places has little in common in either photographic approach or spirit with The Americans by Robert Frank, whose attitude was openly subjective and critical. It seems to me that Stephen Shaw saw at that time, in the early and mid-70s, in Evans' work, and probably Evans' work reworked through pop and conceptualism, an antidote to a too lyrical and overtly critical / political approach that in many ways Robert Frank would have embodied at that time. We know how Evans presented himself in the 60s and 70s as a kind of disinterested observer, and Shaw at that time would have probably made his own the words that Evans wrote in an unpublished note for a reissue of American Photographs in the early 60s. I quote, "The objective picture of America in the 30s made by Evans was neither journalistic nor political in technique and intention. It was reflective rather than tendentious and in a certain way disinterested." End of quote. Yet it is worth mentioning in the context of the 70s and the early 80s that this kind of non-judgmental approach that was that of Shaw was very seldom, if not never, compared to that of Evans in the 30s. If already at that time Evans was for sure a major influence, no critics of the time made that comparison and established that parallel. More than documentary or more than objectives, one of the words that come back when mentioning Shaw's work in that period is deadpan. Deadpan, the adjective used in the 60s and early 70s to describe works by several artists Shaw was interested, Ed Ruscha and Andy Warhol in particular. For example, at Light Gallery in 73, a review of the exhibition Uncommon Places, published in Art Forum, ascribed to the photographs a deadpan quality, which the writer attributed to Warhol's influence, accentuated here by the 8x10 scale and also the sheer amount of high focus detail. 3 years later, an exhibition of Uncommon Places at the Museum of Modern Art elicited similar commentary in the same magazine, and the critic noted the deadpan vernacular of most of Shaw's shots, linked this time not to Warhol, but to conceptual art. Deadpan, of course, refers not only to Shaw's fascination with transparencies and surfaces, but also to this attitude of neutrality, like in fact the architects Robert Venturi and Scott Brown again, who had developed a method of looking non-judgmentally at the environment in the hope of learning from everything. So like Shaw approached all of his subjects with equal attention and lack of criticism. In the same perspective, in their focus on themes of the ordinary and banal in American culture, as well as in their descriptive restraint, The photographs of uncommon places were at the time they were first shown likely linked to photorealism paintings of the same period. Once again, a quote from Art Forum in '74 saying, "Your set is conditioned if you've already looked at photorealist paintings before seeing Shaw photographs." Adding, Shaw and photorealist Richard Estes share at least one influence, Eugène Atget. Similarly, an essay in Art in America 2 years later said Stephen Shaw's photographs, and I quote, "Stephen Shaw's photographs, color images of city intersections and small town crossroads, have a direct connection to photorealist painting. His disposition of his subject matter is closest, perhaps, to Ralph Goings, but a number of other post-pop painters are also recalled." This parallel between, of course, photorealism and Shaw bring forward the issue of color. Of course, there's an apparent contradiction in both referring to Evans as a major influence and at the very same time adopting color photography that Evans had so vividly rejected. Evans' distaste for color is well known, a position he declared in '69, 2 years before Shaw began making color photographs. Paradoxically, it is in fact the same photographer who is most often cited in the articles from the mid to late '70s as the spiritual father of the new American color photography. So in both the favored subject matter of Shaw's generation, a resolutely American contemporary landscape marked by human presence, and the kind of detachment linked to the widespread use of the view camera, the influence of Evans seemed ever present despite his antipathy toward color. In a sense, in fact, Shaw took to our heart Evans' remarked about the validity of applying color to vulgar subjects, unremarkable architecture, motels, gas stations, fast food, joints, and other non-places. Shaw chose to devote himself to these subjects that we would call vulgar in terms of common, popular, without obvious aesthetic qualities when he began using color and as he worked throughout the '70s on American surfaces and uncommon places. As a conclusion, I would like to quote Carl von Vechten, the writer and photographer, who wrote, quote, "If everything in America, in American civilization were destroyed except Walker Evans' photographs, they could tell us a great deal about American life," end of quote. This metaphor about photos as archaeological documents reminds me first of one critic of the new topographic exhibition at Rochester in '75, who wrote in Art Week, as good archaeological documents should the photographer in the exhibition have the transparencies of windows through which the man-altered landscape can be seen. But it also brings to my mind the fact that Shaw, in 2005, in an interview, he was asked the question, what could you imagine doing if you didn't do what you do? And he responded, archaeology. In the '90s in particular, Shaw was fascinated by the discipline, reading extensively on the subject in journals and books and undertaking various photographic projects around excavation sites. In addition to his archaeological works of the '90s, other images of Shaw's can be seen to have an anthropological and even archaeological aspects, capturing traces of everyday activities, store windows, signage, the remains of meals, discarded items. Many of his photographs serve as a kind of archaeological survey. Though often devoid of human presence, most of Shaw's images focused on humanity, our habits, movements, and meals, the place where we live, work, and play, and are, in this respect, a veritable archaeology of the contemporary world in the making. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Quentin, for this wonderful presentation and for walking us through those various parallels. I would now suggest that you start your dialogue on whichever aspect you want to pick up on the respective presentations that you've heard, and then in about 10 to 15 minutes, we will open the discussion to the audience.
Thank you. I don't know, I thought I would start off maybe, well, there's two things that you mentioned in your talk that I think would be interesting to kind of develop and talk a bit more about. One is this moment of 71 that I mentioned in terms of Evans's exhibition, but also interestingly was the first exhibition that Shore had at the Met at the same time in 1971. He was, as far as I understand, the youngest living photographer to have a photographic exhibition at the Met at that time. So I think that's an interesting moment to think about, that these two shows are happening simultaneously, if there's something that we could draw out of that relationship, or even to kind of think about Sarkowski's place in some of this kind of reimagining of documentary, because he's kind of circulating around this a bit. And then the other issue that I found kind of fascinating is this, because I think this is something that I've been kind of thinking about in terms of writing histories of documentary or thinking historically around documentary, is this kind of fascination with this 18-month period, or as you said, maybe it's not 18 months, it's 5 years, in relation to what is an incredibly long career that these retrospectives ostensibly allowed us to imagine to see in 71, even though, as far as I know, Sarkowski was not that interested in Evans's fortune work, which you shared with us. And I'm just thinking that because of the way that Shore would probably be very interested, as you're suggesting, in what Evans does with photographs in the printed page, the kind of uses of photographs, and not just thinking about the kind of art print. So those are some things that were kind of circulating, or I was thinking about as you were speaking. I don't know if we could, pick up on some of that.
Well, it's true that probably I would say the knowledge that Evans and probably Sekula had of Evans' work in the early 70s or late 60s or early 70s is probably very different from our knowledge of Walker Evans's work. Of course, I would say the rereading of Evans' late work had not been really done at that time, especially his color work that was still in limbos, which was a paradox because, in fact, at that time, John Sarkowski was starting to promote new color photography, but in the end, he was not that interested in the very interesting, though, work that Walker Evans had done for Fortune in the post-war years. So it's true that the knowledge of Walker Evans was very different. And there's also another element, which is how Evans himself reworked and rethought or reenacted almost the role he had played in the 30s, trying to build a history or trying to build a figure that was maybe slightly different from the young Evans he was in the 30s. This is something that you find often, in fact, with photographers of a certain age. I can feel exactly the same kind of rereading of one's work with Cartier-Bresson in the same years in France, where he suddenly stresses or underlines his relationship with surrealism, so establishing himself as an artist more than I would say documentary / journalist photographer. Which
let go of this idea that he's a reporter as well, and he uses that word very, very much in his early writings and interviews,
yes.
And then it kind of starts to disappear from his discourse.
Yeah, and then he stresses, yes, his relationship with André Breton, with surrealism, with paintings of the 20s and 30s, and how all this had a strong influence on him. So there's, in a way, the same kind of itinerary for Cartier-Bresson and Evans, and the same way they rewrite, rethink their own history and their own biography, which is something very very, very interesting. You mentioned the 1970 or 71, I can't remember, Met exhibition that Shore had. Yeah. And indeed, he was the youngest photographer who had a retrospective at the Met. But in fact, the work that he was showing at that time was in fact very different from American surfaces and from uncommon places. It was serial work, very, very conceptual in the way that he was more looking at Ed Ruscha or Douglas Hubler or these artists and photographers the late 60s. So in a way, he was not at all into worker events, or less into worker events at that time than he became in 71. And it's really with American surfaces and more with uncommon places that he brings forward that worker events influence.
I have another kind of random question, which you might not know the answer to, and it's a very picky little thing, but do you happen to know that the issue of American Photographs that Stephen Shore got when he was, I can't remember how old you said, is it the 1960 edition or is it the 1938 edition?
No, it was the 1938 edition, because he was 10 in 58. So that was for his 10th birthday. So that was the first edition. Yeah.
No, because I think one of the things, at least the way I kind of think about Sekula's reinvestigation of, or remaking, as I call it, and is kind of thinking about the reinvention of documentary, as you're suggesting as well, has more to do with Evans in the 60s than it necessarily the 71. We hold up this 71 moment because of those exhibitions and because of that interview, and that really kind of generates a certain kind of moment. But the reissuing of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and the reissuing of American Photographs obviously happened about 10 years earlier. And I think it's that moment, or as well as something that I talk about in the book, is the exhibition The Bitter Years that Steichen did, which was his final kind of blockbuster exhibition in which he rehung the photographs from the Farm Security Administration. So at that moment in the early 60s, there was this attempt to revisit the 30s in a very different light, simply by thinking about this, obviously in relation to the war and coming out and the Depression, but also just the simple ways in which slight changes were made in these publications, so that the way in which we received them shifted in that kind of way. So I think that's why I wanted to know about which edition of the book he might have had access to.
Sekula mentions in some of his interviews worker events. Are there other photographers of, let's say, the 20s or 30s, of the early history of photography that he mentions in also explicitly?
Sorry, say who?
Are there other photographers of the either 19th or early 20th century that Sekula mentions in a very explicit way or acknowledges?
Well, the obvious ones would be like August Sander, who he mentions a lot in Fish Story, Ache a bit. In some of the later work or I can't remember now if I'm remembering this from reading it in Sekula or reading in some of the new writing around Dorothea Lange, but I know that he was interested in one of the series that Lange did, a waterfront series that she published. I think it's in Fortune, although I can't remember exactly. So I think for me, it seems that there was a kind of sticking point around Evans, although there are other photographers from that moment that he was thinking about. But I think one of the other things that's really important to recognize with Sekula's kind of revisiting of Evans is that it's never just photographers, it's also the people who are writing at that time as well. And so especially in that Carlos Gara long interview, Sekula does talk a lot about Evans, but he also spends a lot of time talking about Agee. And for me, that's a very important point to bring up, that these were collaborations, and Lange was working with Thaler and Evans was working with Agee or Carlton Beals, or throughout, in these different book projects and these different collaborations. And I think Sekula especially is someone who paid attention to those other participants or the collaborators, as well as American literary tradition, whether it's Twain or Melville or, Crane, a whole host of people that he's interested in building this, and that Evans obviously saw himself as part of that. Or if we take Evans's, in the way in which he remembers his life, he saw himself as part of that literary tradition as well. This kind of early American modernism. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's also a reference that is probably dear to Stephen Shaw, you know, the early American modernism from Walt Whitman to the idea of the artless style, you know, of a style that would be like glass, that would be completely transparent, which is something that that is, I think, also very important to underline. Yeah.
I don't know if I haven't been paying attention to time, so I'm not sure if where we are.
You're all good. We're at the 10-minute mark, so that's excellent. I'd suggest we kick off the round of questions. I'd like to start with a first question, and then we'll open up to the audience. Audience members, there's a function where you can raise your hand virtually if you want to ask a question, and then we can unmute you later on and allow you to talk. For now, I would like to briefly go back to what Quentin talked about at the end of his talk, the issue of color. So given Evans's attachment to mediation, I was wondering whether both of you could comment a little bit more on the role of color in documentary renewals. So Quentin Bajac said briefly that he reminded us of Evans's rejection of color, but at the same time, when we're reading Stephanie's book, especially the coda, you mention how he revisited his work in the early 1970s with Polaroid film in color. And Stephen Shore, of course, is known for his pioneering use of color around the same period. So where would you place color? What role would you attribute to color in the documentary as a form with a history, and how does this perhaps alter the encounter with the documentary?
Quentin, do you want to start, or you want?
Well, I think that first you cannot talk about color, but you should talk about different uses of color. You can have very different aspects of color. And for example, going back to Shaw, you know, it's really interesting to see that when he was the first and the only photographer in the new topographic exhibition who was showing only color works. The other were all in black and white. And when you look at the critics, the very few critics, there were not many critics around the exhibition at that time, they all talk about the kind of muted, bland, anti-heroic use of photography. And these are not anti-heroic, are not the words that they use, but that's the word that I use. So it was, of course, very different and radically different from the, I would say, enchanting or heroic use of commercial photography, etc., etc. And this is something that you find throughout in the 70s and 80s, throughout the text around the Shaw's images, the fact that they're really muted. And the fact that they are sometimes compared to black and white. Of course, Evans was not alone in his rejection of color photography. You know, Paul Strand also Shaw mentioned Paul Strand telling him that color cannot convey higher emotions. So there was always that idea of a difference between high and low, you know, between something that could be trivial, vulgar, and something that could communicate feeling and a kind of lyricism. But then, as you know, from the early 80s and even before, you know, color became stopped being a kind of subgenre, you know, of photography, and it was a given. In fact, for Short generation, it was a given, and that's very different from the generation before. And they were using color because that was the most common, and in fact, all the amateurs were using color. Having said this, you know that in the early 90s, when everyone was switching to color, Shaw decided to go back to black and white because he said that color was beginning to be a convention, and in fact a lot of his work from the 90s are purely black and white work.
Back and forth.
So there's always, you know, that question about what color can communicate, and you can see many different opinions. You know, I'm thinking of, for example, David Goldblatt. David Goldblatt is a good example because he was one of the greatest documentary photographers of the 70s, 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and doing most of his work in black and white, and then he switched to color. And he said, but he switched to color at the end of the apartheid system. You know, and he said that before that he could not use color because color could not convey the hunger, the fear that was that of the apartheid. So he could only switch to color at that time. I don't know, and I'm probably not answering your question, but maybe I should let Stephanie.
Oh, you did. You did, absolutely. Absolutely. If you want to briefly answer, Stephanie, and then I think we have a few hands to answer.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I don't have too much to say about color. I feel like Quentin said a lot more. I mean, obviously the photographs I was showing by Sekula are in color, and I don't know exactly whether in his career how he made when he made that decision, or how in terms of obviously the 70s, the early work that I was showing in black and white. But I guess just picking up on the point that you were just making about David Goldblatt, I mean, obviously as Sally Stein has taught us about documentary and color, you know, the color was being used, you know, there were color photographs that we know of in the archive from the 30s, but you know, the ways in which color was repressed or not shown. And for me, when I was thinking about this in terms of thinking about Shore and knowing that color was obviously going to be part of the conversation here, was thinking back to kind of one of Sekula's texts from the 90s, well, from the late 90s, from when he, around documentary, where he revisits documentary, this, I'm gonna mess up the exact title, but something about LA being the graveyard of documentary. He talks very clearly about this idea of documentary being overcoded and how we can't see, you know, documentary becomes a certain convention and you can't get out of that in a certain way. And I think maybe that's part of the conversation about color and documentary as well, or black and white and documentary, has to be about that idea of overcoding and the way in which something becomes legible or illegible at certain moments, such that you could have color documentary in color the way that you couldn't at certain other moments, in terms of how signs are being read. So that's really the way I would kind of think about it in terms of this larger kind of history of documentary.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. You just made a perfect transition because we have a question from Sally Stein in the audience, and I will allow her to talk. Let's try to see if this works. Yes.
First of all,
Hi.
This is a wonderful pair of presentations. And my question ultimately for both of you is if you would like to elaborate on some of the distinctions between the photographer as detached observer and participant observer. But I would like to add just a couple of comments because yes, I am the widow of Allan Sekula and knew him fairly well. First of all, the shipyard, Stephanie referred to a seaport picture by Dorothea Lange. It's really the Oakland shipyards during World War II, and of people leaving the shipyards that Lange photographed. Later, actually, I think Gap even somehow got a hold of this picture and used it as an advertisement, because they are all wearing kind of dungaree-like pants, etc. The women too. But along with Evans and sometimes a little bit Lange, less so. Hine was certainly very important, and Stieglitz maybe as a bad object. And also he read voraciously, and Walter Benjamin, when he first got translated in the late 60s, was extremely important. But also this idea, which Benjamin borrowed from Camille Recht, about Atget's photography as scenes of crime. He loved reading at the low end, as well as lots of high theory crime novels, novels about the crimes of California and its affluence. I do want to say one thing about the Eastman House show of the landscapes. All these young photographers were trying to work in an undercoded fashion, and it seemed to me very much in reaction to the hyper-symphonic use of black and white by Ansel Adams in relation to the landscape. And finally, I want to say something about color. First of all, one of Allan's fairly early pieces was about the color snapshots that his parents made.
The meditation on a triptych.
Yes, and so he grew up in a world that more and more began to feel that color was part of its real surround, its vernacular. But I think it's really important, and I don't know that this has been mentioned before, that Shore, who got this very elegant book when on his 10th birthday, grew up in a world of makers of color. It is my understanding that his family fortune devised from something I recall as a young girl, which is these cheap pocketbooks in white and black that had variable color trims that you could snap on and off. So color is a sign both of the new commerce of the post-war era, but it really dates back to the 1920s in America, but also of the transience. You can change it. There's a line from The Wizard of Oz of 1939, which is, you can even dye my eyes to match my hair. I may have this wrong right now, but it's something like this about being able to change everything. These pocketbooks of the 1950s, which were a mad craze. I remember like at the age of 7 thinking, oh, that would be cool to be able to have pocketbooks with different color trim. But I was too young to get a pocketbook. But I believe that's one of the sources of the very different world in which Stephen Shore grew up than Allan Sekula grew up. Enough for me. I'd love to hear you talk more about detached observers and observers who think of themselves as participant observers. Thank you. And thanks for a great set of presentations, which I will recommend to everyone to hear when they're posted by Terra.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you for the Lang reference, and also the crime thing I think is so important as well, especially because, and I'll get to your other question, but especially because of the great essay, which I didn't mention, but Walker Evans and the Police, where Sekula does spend a lot of time talking about crime and the crime novel in relation to Evans's work and his mention of police photographs. And the Ansel Adams thing as well, yeah. So detached observer, participant observer, yeah, I mean, it's something that, of course, I've thought a lot about in terms of thinking specifically about the relationship between Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and Aerospace Fake Tales, with the kind of, if I'm getting your question right, the kind of relationship of Sekula to his subjects, or, you know, in terms of this was him photographing in his own family and the way in which he shot those photographs and the kind of, I just keep thinking, like, several of them where you feel like people are just entering the rooms, although some of them seem more kind of staged in terms of bookshelves and photographs of on the wall and stuff. Whereas the kind of way in which we think about Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and a lot of documentary of the documentary products of the 1930s is that, you know, these were outsider photographers coming in, you know, to, at least in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, to photograph subjects that they weren't kind of participating in. Although I think with Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, those kind of distinctions become a bit muddied. And I guess one of the things that I always kind of think of in relation to, especially something like now, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, is the way in which in that project in particular, A.G., you know, makes a very important point at the beginning of that book in which he kind of announces that he sees these participants as a kind of cast of characters, which include him and Evans as well, as a, you know, a journalist traveling as a spy and a photographer traveling as a spy. And so I think sometimes we keep these distinctions kind of separate, and it was a way, I think, to separate the quote unquote reinvention of documentary from what was happening in the 30s and create this kind of bad object for the 30s. But I actually think one of the things that Aerospace Folktales got me to see about Let Us Now Praise Famous Men was that sometimes those inside-outside kind of distinctions don't hold up as well. But I'm not sure if that's exactly the what you were thinking of, but I'll pass it over to Quentin.
Well, talking about, and if I should focus on Stephen Shaw, you know, we could say that detached / participant observer is maybe also one of the differences between American surfaces, which is shot with this small portable camera, and which is in fact a diary of a year and a half, where he shoots, you know, people. He meets hotels, he goes to meals, he eats, etc., etc. So there's a kind of, you know, participant observer, which is very obvious, and then he switches to a 4x5 and 8x10 camera, and everything is more distant and more detached. Even if he's probably fully aware of the fact that he's making an image and that making an image is in a way part of the image, is far more detached. But to that detached participant observer, I would like to add another distinction that Stephen Shaw makes, is that even if he uses an 8x10 large cumbersome camera, etc., this 8x10 camera is for him a kind of way of losing a little control over the image. So there's the kind of distinction between an observer in complete control of the image and an observer who has lost a kind of control over the image, because he says that with the 8x10 camera, you cannot, you know, see exactly everything that's happening on the ground glass. So you take the image, but without being absolutely able to know exactly what is happening, and you have to accept the accident, chance, luck, and bad luck also from time to time. So I think that it's not only about, he's a detached, but he's a detached observer who has accepted to lose a little control over his image, and that's very important for him.
Thanks for that point.
Thank you very much for that question. We have another participant who would like to ask a question, and that is Benjamin Young. I will allow him to talk.
Hi all, thanks very much for some great talks. I'm going to, I think, press Sally's great question a little bit about maybe the differences between Shore and Sekula, just because I assume that Sekula would take a dim view of the alleged neutrality attributed to Shore. And I was just thinking that there are very few enterprises as politicized as archaeology is in a place like Israel. And so while I hear a certain agreement about Evans as a resource, I wanted to invite Stephanie and Quentin to disagree on the stakes of Evans. And we've already heard a little bit about kind of participant versus detached. And I would maybe just suggest one other avenue for this would be the importance of Evans's montage aesthetic in American photographs, as well as his engagement with text in Now Let Us Praise Famous Men, being another important difference from what Sekula takes from Evans versus Shore.
Thanks, Ben. Great question. I mean, yeah, when we first started to prepare for this dialogue, I mean, I thought it was kind of actually great to bring these two photographers together in a way, because in some way I feel like they're seeing if we want to call it influence, if we want to call it a kind of the relationship with Evans, or to the what Evans stood for as a past, could not be more, you know, diametrically opposed in a way, especially that as if they were just inheriting two very different photographers. And for me, that I find that really productive, as well as a way to think around this kind of problem that I'm trying to kind of hash out, or continue to trying to hash out, about what we do with this past. So yeah, I think that is really important to bring up. I mean, one of the things that I discuss as well in the book is this kind of contradiction between a photographer who, however we want to take this kind of no politics for Evan, is become so important to a photographer who kind of, you know, insists on the politics of his work, or insisted on the politics of his work, and the kind of way in which that needs to be kind of mapped out. So yeah, I think, you know, Sekula would have a big problem with the kind of reading of Shore's reading of Evans in those kinds of ways around transparency and neutrality. I think also a really interesting way to kind of bring those, to bring this out, would be actually around the New Topographics exhibition, particularly because Sekula had such at least in his writings from School as a Factory, or like I think the postscript or the end of School of the Factory, does not talk about Stephen Shore, but does talk about that exhibition and Louis Baltz's work in that. And I think that would be another kind of moment of kind of thinking through what happens, particularly to landscape in America at that moment, which I think we could also see Let Us Now Praise Famous Men as part of, if we accept my interest in reading that project in relation to questions of privacy, domesticity, property, as a kind of way, a kind of bringing that back at that moment, as well as about a kind of retort to those kind of conceptions of landscape. So I think that's also another place where we could see these kind of very divergent, you know, 1975 histories in a certain kind of way. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have another question? Would anybody like to raise their hand? Yes, I'll get to you in just a second. Deborah Jenner.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, thank you for letting me ask a question. I was fascinated by this whole idea of color in photography, which, as you said, was more in the 70s. What I'd like to know is, just going back before World War I, you had, of course, Les Frères Lumière, who were doing documentaries in color for Albert Kahn all over the world. And I wondered if there was any reference or inspiration from that enormous bank of documentary color photos. And also, if you go back to America at that time, before World War I, you had Arthur Dow, who was teaching his composition at Clarence White and also at Columbia. And in the composition, he was doing the arbitrary color as a variation of his no-tan. So this idea of interchangeable colors, which you brought up with that commercial purse or something with the trim. And then, of course, if we jump back there to the 60s and 70s, contemporary, there's nobody better about arbitrary exchangeable colors in photography than Andy Warhol, who was making a cocktail of photography silkscreened and then add an arbitrary color. So I just wondered if any of those influences were valid for the color that we saw in your presentation.
Well, let me try to, shall I go first, Stephanie?
Yeah. I think it's more directed at you.
Yeah, it's definitely directed at you.
Mentioning the first name that you spoke about, Albert Kahn and the Archives of the Planet. I'm pretty sure that neither Sekula nor Shore knew about this work. That were, in fact, yeah, it's true that many photographers were hired by Albert Kahn to go all over the world to take autochromes pictures that are still in the Musée Albert Kahn in Paris. But you know, that was in a way quite private, even if some images were reproduced in the press, but that there was no history of photography at that time, or nearly no history of photography. And definitely the Albert Kahn project remained mysterious and unseen for a long time. The second is Arthur Doe and the no-tan, Arthur Doe's no-tan. I would say that was probably, Arthur Doe was probably, as with his connection with Stiglitz and Clarence White, and I would say pictorialist photography, was probably the kind of artist that both Sekula and Shore rejected at that time. We talk about, there was still that anti-Stiglitz / pictorialist attitudes among, you know, modern artists and modern photographers of the period. And I think that Arthur Doe, but maybe I'm wrong, but I think that Arthur Doe would have been, in a way, considered as someone whose work was definitely not of Sekula's and Shore's interest. The last is Andy Warhol, and concerning Andy Warhol, probably Sekula and Shore had very different attitudes, because for Shore, I mentioned Warhol was a real mentor Shaw went and spent at least almost 2 years at the factory between 65 and 67, when he was still very early. He was still a teenager. So hanging around and taking many pictures. And in fact, he has always said that Andy Warhol was once again, through looking at Andy Warhol and through looking at how Andy Warhol produced and had his period of production and conversation and leisure, etc., how it completely, in fact, redefined for him what an artist was. And so I think that Stephen Shaw, not only the man, but also the work, was very important for Shaw. And I was mentioning American surfaces with this idea of surface, which is saying it's a very Warholian concept. I think that's the idea that there's, in fact, no depth, that what you see is what you see. What you see is what is, and there's no distinction between the visual and the kind of hidden reality is something that is really important to.
That's a clin d'oeil, because when it's what you see is what you get. With Andy Warhol, it's just a way of making a reference to Zen and Tathagata, which is deeper than anything else you could say. So the surface is everything, but the surface is also the ultimate reality. So when you say it's only the surface, you know, it's just playing, it's a tease.
Stephanie, do you want to add something, or?
I mean, no, I feel like you've.
Warhol.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm gonna go there.
Oh, okay. Okay. We have time for 2 more questions. Rebecca Zorier and James Swenson have raised their hands, so I will get to Rebecca Zorier first. Allowed to talk? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I've been wondering about the word deadpan that came up in at least one of the talks. When we start using it with regard to these photographers, what the different speakers think of it as a relevant concept. And I just looked it up, that evidently it appears in English in 1928, inspired partly by Buster Keaton. So it's kind of contemporary with Evans. But is it a useful concept, or was it used at the time?
Well, it was used at the time, and probably to talk about a kind of position or attitude that was, as I said, non-judgmental, but maybe non-judgmental with a small touch of irony. I think there's also a hint of humor in the idea of deadpan, which is definitely why it was sometimes, you know, used to characterize the world, the work of Andy Warhol and some others, but also, you know, Robert Venturi and Dennis Scott Brown, who had that kind of sometimes ironical look at the world. So I think it's an interesting concept. And I think that's interesting that at that time, and I still don't know exactly why, you know, suddenly in the 60s and early 70s, that term becomes in a way kind of fashionable among art critics of the time. This is something that probably some research would help us understanding, but it's interesting that around that time it becomes quite used in that kind of pop, post-pop, and in a way postmodern aesthetic that was in a way developing at that time. Yeah, a non-judgmental and yet slightly humorous view of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't come across it so much in thinking about Evans's work or Sekula's work in relation, or as a kind of historical term in terms of thinking about documentary, but the reference to Buster Keaton is really interesting. Yeah, I had another question, but I'll wait and see if there's time at the end, just because I know someone else is waiting to ask the question.
Yes, thank you. We'll take one last question from the audience by James Swenson, and then we'll see if there's time at the end. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Usually you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, thank you for the papers, and I'll make this quick. Thanks too for expanding this notion of Walker Evans and Company. I've really enjoyed it. My question is mainly for Stephanie, but Quentin can jump in too. Stephanie, you mentioned that Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is about class, and I agree. But I was wondering if you could also speak, and especially as we saw with Sekula's work today, about this urban versus rural divide. And I think obviously that's something that is so palpable for where we are right now in the United States and on the eve of this election. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, especially as, you know, we saw Sekula going into kind of the hinterland and photographing rural populations, just like Walker Evans is going down to Alabama. And I think that it's an interesting way of thinking or looking at that. I was wondering if you could speak to.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've been thinking about in relation to actually this new project that Caroline mentioned at the beginning, is kind of thinking about actually the way in which we could begin to imagine the photographs, the documentary, as a kind of, think about it as in the relation to the genre of landscape. And I'm not trying to kind of replace one mode of representation for another, but I do think the kind of relationship to the land and relation to property is so central to what is being photographed at this moment, or the way in which it's really being discussed, that, and sometimes it is overdetermined by the urban photographs by Evan, particularly the one that I showed at the beginning, which is at the end of the first part of American Photographs twice, of the South Street from 1932, I believe it is. And so, yeah, I think it is important to recall the kind of pastoral part of American documentary. And one of the reasons why I think this is also really important, and why I also wanted to focus on prayer for the Americans, is because I think what we're seeing, or at least I think Sekula allows us to see, and this is something that I spend a lot of time talking about in the book, is a very different history of Americanism that has very much to do with the kind of problem of empire. And I think that in relation to Evans's work in Cuba, but I don't necessarily think that you have to go beyond the continental United States to understand the kind of way in which America has always kind of thought itself as having no outside in a certain kind of way. And so thinking Twain through the Spanish-American War, thinking Sekula going into that Middle West, and that term was actually, I particularly use that term because that's what Lincoln Kirstein uses to describe that geography in American photographs, and thinking about these kinds of geographies of the United States, that I do think it's very important to kind of bring this history of the relationship between empire and America into 30s documentary, and not just allow it to be kind of inside or outside in a certain kind of way. So I'm not sure, hopefully that answers your question, but I think it is a really important way to kind of shift focus, which is what I've been trying to do in terms of thinking about the depression in relation to the rural. But obviously, and this is something I didn't stress, but I think was kind of under the talk, or I hope was percolating behind it, is the kind of politics of race that sit in relation to the land, in relation to property, and in this moment, as well as in our current moment as well. That's something that we would obviously need another seminar to kind of draw out. I don't know. Quentin, do you want to?
I think you're absolutely right, Stephanie. We have time for your last question to wrap this up.
I mean, maybe it's not worth now. We could just, I just wanted to kind of think more. I just thought maybe just the kind of hearing Quentin talk about irony and deadpan just made me kind of go back to that original question I had around like the influence of Sarkowski here, because I feel like he's this kind of phantom figure in this, and it also goes back to Benjamin Young's question. He's this kind of phantom figure in this kind of history, because as far as I recall or have read, is that, you know, one of Shore's decisions to change cameras was because Sarkowski was like, basically said to him, what are you focusing on? Where's the frame? And it allowed him to kind of rethink the kind of formal values of his photograph, and that kind of emergence of a formalism in the 70s within the history of photography, and in Sarkowski's kind of role in the way in which written those histories of documentary, whether it's from New Documents or the Evans exhibition or a whole slew of shows around journalism as well that Sapkowski was doing. I just feel that that's needs, you know, is kind of sitting in this conversation as well. And so I don't know, I just wanted to kind of add that to the mix a little bit. I don't know if you have a response to that or not.
I don't.
Okay. All right. I guess that on that note.
Yes, I guess on that note, that definitely wraps it up, and that's a good moment to end the conversation. In any case, we're running out of time. There are more questions, but of course, as you said, we'd need another seminar for this. So thank you very much to Stephanie Schwartz and Quentin Bajac for this wonderful conversation, and thank you also very much to the audience for all of your exciting input. Thank you for attending this talk. Lucy, would you like to add something at the end?
Yes, I'd just like to reiterate our thanks on behalf of the Terra Foundation, and thank you for our audience for joining in as well. We'll be posting information soon about our next online events, so please don't hesitate to join again. Thank you, Stephanie and Quentin, and thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.